In this video, we're going to start talking about ways that nationalist and non-nationalist loyalties can compete with each other. So we're looking at how those types of loyalties can conflict, and the reason we're doing this is because we want to think about how those conflicting loyalties can be resolved. Not all of the cases that we're going to talk about here can or have been resolved. But we do want to think about people's motivations and why they are reacting in particular ways. So, one very common set of loyalties to conflict with each other are class and nationalist loyalties. Most societies end up being divided, intentionally or not, into socioeconomic classes. Divisions based off of wealth, status, education levels, career choices. Sometimes ancestry, heritage, or ethnicity can play a role into it as well. The caste system in parts of India are an example where ethnicity has played a role into it, as well as heritage, who your parents are. Other times this is less formal, but still exists. We still think of lower class, middle class, and upper class today, even though social systems like this date all the way back to the earliest recorded histories and even into prehistory. If people accept those divisions, no conflicts ends up ensuing. But when the system does get questioned, you end up with conflicting national and class loyalties, and you can end up with conflict. French Revolution was an example of this. Much closer to home, during the Great Depression, there was thousands of working class people marching off in protest to the Alberta Parliament, demanding economic support and food. What brought these people together wasn't that they were Albertans. It was that they were factory workers. They believed that the government wasn't paying enough attention to them. They were starving. They didn't have money to buy food. And they needed both economic and basic need support. And what ended up happening is that the Alberta Parliament sent the cops after them. The provincial police rode into the crowd, injuring dozens of people, arresting some people, and while some cases that did go to trial ended up in convictions, they were overall fairly minor things that people were getting convicted for. Meanwhile, they're marching because they believe that they have the right to be able to protest and be able to use the land that's held in common. And even today, people still remember this. It's an interesting bit of Albertan history because it's actually closely tied with the growing communist and socialist movements of the time, which is the polar opposite of what Alberta is known for today. Another example of these conflicting loyalties is the state of Iraq for on a century now. While the modern state of Iraq has changed hands several times, the government has changed many times. The physical boundaries that make up Iraq, the geopolitical lines in the sand, were set shortly after World War I, as the European powers were dividing up the different realms that were once the Ottoman Empire into their own territories and client states. So Iraq ended up being a kingdom initially, but there were many, many different changes. The modern day Iraq dates to right after World War II. And of course, the current political state in the country owes itself to the 2003 invasion by the Americans, believing that Saddam Hussein, or saying that they believed that Saddam Hussein was hosting weapons of mass destruction and could have been involved with the Taliban. All of this is important to understand because the geopolitical lines in the sand that make up Iraq didn't pay attention to any known linguistic, cultural, ethnic, or religious divisions that existed within the region. So when Iraq was created, it was a whole bunch of people that didn't get along and who weren't really connected to each other. They weren't unified. So while there certainly is a sense of there are Iraqis today, there are also very deep divisions, both ethnically and religiously, within the country. There are three main groups. There are the Kurds, who are mostly Sunni. There are Sunni Arabs, who are another minority within the country, and there are also Shia Arabs. Now, just because the Kurds and some of the Kurds and some of the Arabs are both Sunni, also doesn't mean they're the same types of Sunnis. The Arabs are mostly Shafi, the Kurds are mostly Hanafi, and for completion's sake, the Shiites are mostly a group known as the Twelvers or the Imamiyah. Each of these have distinctive cultural lines, they have distinctive religious lines and religious beliefs, and under Saddam Hussein, Saddam was Sunni. He oppressed the majority Shiites. Now that the Shiites have more power since Saddam's overthrow, the Sunnis are more likely to be oppressed, and the Kurds have been oppressed by both groups. And as we talked about in previous chapters, desperately want to separate from the rest of the country and have their own nation of Kurdistan. So there's conflict between the religious connections and the greater nation here. The religious loyalties are stronger than the nationalist loyalties, and a lot of the conflict in Iraq today can be traced to that. You can also have regional loyalty. This one is one particularly well known within Alberta. Regional loyalty could be an area within the country, loyalty to Western Canada. It could be an area within the province, northern Alberta, or it could be to Calgary or Edmonton or Red Deer specifically, or it could be to an area that crosses provincial borders too. So the prairie provinces oftentimes make up a block with similar concerns, so there could be the loyalty to the prairies within Canada. And people often express their regional loyalty by actively promoting the interests of that region. Does that mean that it automatically negates national loyalty? No, but the two of them can certainly come into conflict. This is what happened in Alberta in the 1980s, and in fact, a lot of Western alienation to this day can be traced to what we're about to talk about. So in the 1970s, Canada was suffering from massive inflation, which is rising prices, along with a decreased purchasing power of the dollar. So each dollar buys you less. By 1978, the inflation had eased down, but just 2 years later, in 1980, it had come back specifically with oil. And this is a difficult situation for Canada at the time. The reason that is difficult is that people across the country relied on oil for energy, and in particular in Ontario and Quebec, they had lots of manufacturing, which means they needed to use lots of energy and lots of oil. Inflation had become a threat again because the high price of oil started to threaten their livelihoods. So, at the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau's government introduced something known as the National Energy Program, or NEP. The idea behind the NEP was to try and make Canada self-sufficient for energy, so make sure that Canadian produced energy was staying within the country so that it could serve the entire nation, to reduce foreign ownership in oil and gas companies, increase the opportunities for Canadians to own those companies, and to protect Canadians against high energy costs, keep the cost of oil and energy low for all Canadians. It's something of a protectionist move. The idea was to try and help, particularly Ontario and Quebec, but also looking across the nation, as this is in the national interest. Here's the perspectives of the Prime Minister and the Alberta Premier, Peter Lougheed, at the time. The needs of the federal government to be able to share a reasonably appropriate degree in the various streams of income across the country through corporate income tax are self-evident. A very high level of provincial royalties obviously erodes the corporate tax base. And then from Peter Lougheed, we view the federal export tax on Albertan oil as contrary to both the spirit and intent of Confederation. It is discriminatory and is a price freeze on all of Alberta's oil production at immense cost to Albertans. So what was the conflict here? Well, what ended up happening was a tax was put on oil exports to encourage companies to keep oil within Canada, to sell it within Canada, but at the same time, a cap was put on the price of oil that was much lower than the price worldwide. So oil producers in Alberta were not able to command as much of a price, as much profit selling within the country, and if they tried to sell out of the country, it would end up not being as favorable for them either. And that led to a bunch of international companies pulling out of Alberta, which costs the province large amounts of money, as well as cost some people their jobs. So there's tension here between trying to do something that could potentially help the entire nation, as opposed to something that very much put Albertans specifically at a disadvantage. And a lot of the grievances today, both with the Trudeaus specifically and with Western alienation in general, go back to the National Energy Program and how Albertans felt that locally, regionally, they were treated unfairly by the rest of the nation. So they have that particular regional loyalty.